Did you know the 2020 U.S. religion census found there are 4.45 million Muslims in the U.S. and that Islam is the third largest religion in the United States behind Christianity and Judaism? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about representation of Arabs and Muslims in the American media with author and scholar Dr. Evelyn Alsultany on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore Arab and Muslim American cultural politics and popular culture with author and scholar Dr. Evelyn Alsultany. But first, a trivia question. Abed Nadir is an endearing character on the popular sitcom Community. What is his father's heritage? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Evelyn Alsultany on the show today. Dr. Alsultany is the leading expert on the history of representation of Arabs and Muslims in the U.S. media. Her research, teaching, and lecturing are driven by a commitment to bringing Arab and Muslim Americans into the broader conversation about racial politics in the USA. Dr. Alsultany received a PhD from Stanford University in 2005. Since 2019, she's been an associate professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She is the author of Arabs and Muslims in the Media, Race and Representation After 9/11, and the co-editor of 2 volumes, Arab and Arab American Feminisms, Gender, Violence, and Belonging, and Between the Middle East and the Americas, The Cultural Politics of the Diaspora. She has served as a consultant for Hollywood studios and independent filmmakers on how to better represent Muslim characters. She also hosts the podcast, Muslims as Seen on TV. Welcome to the show, Evelyn. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Dr. B. Thanks for having me.
So what is the most unique thing about you?
So I have to tell you that questions like this always stump me. So I try to think about how other people react to me and what they think is unique about me. And what a lot of people respond to is that I grew up in New York City to an Iraqi Muslim father, a Cuban Catholic mom, a Colombian Catholic stepmom. And so I grew up in a very diverse environment. So I think that's probably something very unique about me. I remember when I was growing up in New York and I would meet people when we traveled, they would say, "Oh my God, what is it like to grow up in New York?" And I never knew how to answer the question because it was just my life. So it's hard sometimes to see what's unique about you when you're just being you and living your life. But those are things that people usually react around my identity, that it's a unique thing about me.
Growing up on the East Coast like I did, I'm originally from New Jersey. What drew you to California?
You know, I spent the first 25 years of my life in New York, and I was itching for a change. And I actually got into grad school at Stanford when I was 25, and that was when I left. And it's now been 25 years, and I go back to New York often, but I haven't lived there now in 25 years. And I actually lived in Michigan for 14 years. My first job after grad school was in Michigan. And then I recently job at the University of Southern California, and I've been in California now for 4 years.
So your area of expertise is the study of Arabs and Muslims in the media. How did that area of study become a passion for you?
So it evolved over time, but really it's rooted in my experiences as a child, growing up in the family that I did, where we were often asked questions about our identity every day of our lives, everywhere that we went. Where are you from? And I watched a lot of TV and pop culture as a child, and most of the representations available to me in the 1980s included, so for Cubans, we had Ricky Ricardo, which was amazing. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we had Al Pacino in Scarface. Not great, but two actual people. And then we're with Colombians, just a drug dealer, no face, no name, just general drug dealer. And we were asked all the time strange questions about Colombia and cocaine often. And then with Arabs, I watched movies like Back to the Future, where there's a Libyan terrorist. I loved Back to the Future. Movies like Rule of the Nile with Michael Douglas. I loved that. Very stereotypical portrayals of Arabs. Raiders of the Lost Ark. Chuck Norris movies were really popular back then. And there was one in particular with Arab. There were a lot of Arab bad guys. And watching people just ask my parents everyday questions about who they were, it was so clear that they were influenced by these images that they had consumed, that I was consuming. And so when I got to grad school, I decided that that would be my focus.
You've stated that you believe your career has been shaped by being in the right place at the right time. Tell us more what you mean about that.
When I got to Stanford, it was 1999. And I had proposed as part of my application to bring Arabs into the conversation about race in the United States. I didn't yet have a project about the media, but I knew, given my upbringing, that I did not grow up with the experience of whiteness. But in ethnic studies, you don't talk about Arabs. And one of my colleagues, Louise Kankar, says that there was a mismatch, there was a misalignment for a long time where you can't talk about Arabs in ethnic studies because according to the census, Arabs are white. You can't talk about Muslims in ethnic studies because that's a religion. We don't do religion in ethnic studies. We talk about race and ethnicity. So I really wanted to learn about Arabs and Muslims in the context of race in the United States. And my advisor at the time said, you know what, you're not going to get a job with this topic. So look at the job listings. You should either do Middle East studies if you're interested in Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East. I was interested in the US, not the Middle East. Or you should do Latino studies if you're interested in the US. There are plenty of jobs for that. And then 2 years later, 9/11 happened. And suddenly my topic was cutting edge. People said, wow, what a topic. That's so cutting edge. And suddenly some jobs became available. So my advisor was right. She wasn't trying to discourage me, but she was trying to alert me to what are the jobs that are available. You're going to spend 6 years getting a PhD on something and not be able to get a job. Suddenly 9/11 happened, and granted, a lot of the opportunities were for people who study terrorism studies, national security studies, but then there was also smaller pockets that didn't exist before in ethnic studies. So my first job was at the University of Michigan in their ethnic studies program. It's called American Culture. And they were open and wanting to see conversations about Arabs and Muslims within ethnic studies. That wouldn't have been possible without 9/11. And I started a program at Michigan called Arabs and Muslim American Studies with a colleague of mine, Nadine Naber. And we often said, during this time, people are being detained, deported, people are dying in wars, Muslims around the world, and we're getting these opportunities. So we're going to try to use these opportunities to educate people and inform people about the issues that are happening. But these moments of crisis, and it has made me very aware of moments of crisis where there's attention to your topic. And I know scholars in other areas feel it too. You could be doing work on anti-Black racism for decades and no one cares. And then suddenly with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, have opportunities that didn't exist before. So that's definitely been my experience in terms of, I wouldn't say right place, right time, but more if it weren't for certain events, historical, political events, then my area of study, people really wouldn't care about it.
So how do you feel like the portrayals of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans have changed from 9/11 now to today, which is 20 years?
So a lot of my research actually tracks this change. And the moment that I decided on my dissertation topic, it was after 9/11. I was watching the television, glued to the TV like everyone else was, trying to figure out what had happened. I expected that there would be more portrayals of Arabs as terrorists, and there were. But what I didn't expect was more sympathetic portrayals of Arab Americans and Muslims in the US. So I noticed that at first, journalists would go on the street and try to interview Arabs and Muslims on their experiences and what it was like for them, and not exclude them from the conversation because they were being excluded and demonized as if they weren't American. But then in addition, on TV dramas and some movies, there arose a new trend, which was that if you were portraying an Arab or Muslim as a terrorist, then the writer producer would throw in a quote unquote good one who is pro-US, working for the FBI, the CIA, willing to fight and die to prove their loyalty. So we got this patriotic character. And on the surface, it's better than all the terrorists that we had seen before. But at the same time, so I started analyzing this, what's happening, how is this working? And what I found was that even though it was better, we were still getting to know Arab and Muslim characters in the context of terrorism, which is very limiting. So you're either good or bad in the context of terrorism. What side of terrorism are you on, as opposed to looking at a variety of stories, a variety of life experiences. So that was very popular for about 10 years after 9/11. And we still see that to a certain extent. It still comes up, but it's not as prominent today as it was. And then we had a few other turning points. In the 2010s, we started seeing some secular Muslim characters. And in my book, I use the term stereotype confined expansions to explain this phenomenon, which is you have a stereotype, let's say the terrorist, and then you're going to respond by creating the patriot. Or you have a stereotype, this fanatical Muslim, you can't reason with them, they're hyper-religious, they're fanatical. Okay, you have the secular Muslim who doesn't care about religion, who's like anyone else, supposedly. And so we had examples. So for the patriot, we saw the patriot in 24, in Homeland, in Quantico, for example. And then the secular Muslim, we see in Aziz Ansari's show, Master of None. Kumail Nanjiani's The Big Sick is another example. I would even put Bravo Shots of Sunset in that category. And then the next shift really happened around Trump's Muslim ban. And the first time Trump articulated the idea for a Muslim ban was before he became president. He was on the campaign trail. It was in 2015. And Hollywood and many others across the country were outraged. And Hollywood actually responded by creating Muslim characters outside of the context of terrorism. And I actually have a long list of productions where we start seeing Muslims and sometimes Arabs too in contexts that have nothing to do with terrorism, a diverse array of storylines. So for example, DC Legends of Tomorrow included an Iranian Muslim superhero. There was a show on NBC called Transplant about a Syrian Muslim refugee doctor trying to remake his life in Canada. On NCIS, LL Cool J's character came out as Muslim. And then there were a bunch of shows that were released more recently that include Rami on Hulu, Mo on Netflix, Ms. Marvel on Disney Plus, Sort of on HBO Max, and We Are Lady Parts on Peacock, that focus on Muslims and really pave a whole new direction of what's possible in terms of representations.
And you go into a lot of depth about this topic in your TEDx talk, which is great. I highly recommend that listeners watch that. And your TEDx talk is called Untapped Stereotypes. And I like the quote that you mentioned by Chimamanda Adichie. And it is, the problem with stereotypes is that is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. Can you talk about that a little bit more in the context of what you were just discussing?
Yes, I love that quote. So the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, it's that they are incomplete. So there are two ways that I think about it in terms of representations of Muslims. So one way would be, okay, we have this terrorist stereotype and he's fanatical, you can't reason with him, he's a threat to the US national security. This is the portrait, it's very one-dimensional. So one way to think about it would be, well, why did this person become a terrorist? What are the political circumstances? Is it just about religion, or is it about various political circumstances that would lead someone to commit an act of violence? So that would be filling out the story. And right now there is a trend in Hollywood to do that. I'm not a particular fan of this trend because we're still talking about terrorism. So for example, season 1 of Jack Ryan had an Arab Muslim terrorist, and it had a very complex portrait where his family was killed when he was a child because of US drone strikes, and he moved to France, and he was very smart, but he couldn't get a job because of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism in France. It's a very complicated portrait of what would lead this person to become a terrorist. So that's one angle. But the other angle is there are 1.8 to 2 billion Muslims in the world, and the terrorist story does not speak to me. It doesn't speak to most Muslims in the world, yet for some reason, and actually the reason is very clear, it's because of repeated media representations, we as Muslims are expected to bear collective responsibility. And there's actually a study that was done by 416 Labs, where they looked at news reporting in the New York Times from 1990 until 2014, and they found that 57% of stories about Muslims associated Muslims with collective responsibility for terrorism. So part of the problem is consuming this image over and over and over again. It has an impact. So one impact is that we bear collective responsibility, even if it's not our story. We have nothing to do with it, but we were expected to account for it in some way. And this repetition is damaging. So I often say in my talks that the problem is not that we are portrayed as terrorists. The problem is that we're rarely portrayed as anything else. So it's the repetition of this. So the ideal would be if the terrorist story was one story. Like with white people, if you see a murderer represented, you don't think all white people are murderers. You don't expect all white people to account for the mass shooting that this person just committed. It's one story of many stories. So when I think about this quote about the problem with stereotypes, it's not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete. I think about the 2 billion Muslims in the world and all the stories that are out there that I would love to learn. I have my own one story, but we have had Arabs and Muslims conflated. So most stories about Muslims are about Arab Muslims as terrorists, where we don't hear a lot about Black Muslims in the US. We certainly don't hear about Indonesian Muslims, which is the most populous Muslim country. So there are just so many stories out there to explore. And in my vision, the goal would be to displace the terrorist story that we've heard over and over again, and to let it just be one of many stories.
In your book, Broken, The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, you discuss how diversity initiatives end up marginalizing Arab Americans and U.S. Muslims. Tell us more about that.
My book, Broken, is looking at how Muslims have come to be included in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which really has happened in the last 10 years or so. And part of what made that possible was recognition of Islamophobia as a problem. So Islamophobia is a very old problem, but we didn't really recognize it as a problem. It didn't enter our lexicon in the US until the 2010s. It wasn't even after 9/11 that we said Islamophobia. It was really in the 2010s that we started using that language. And through that process of recognizing Islamophobia through hate crimes or policies like the Muslim ban, policies like special registration or USA Patriot Act, or the scandal torture at Abu Ghraib, and the many things that happened that highlighted this as a problem, led to recognition and the inclusion of Muslims in diversity initiatives. And in the book, I coined the term crisis diversity to refer to a process where, let's take the Muslim ban, for example, something happens, like the Muslim ban, that raises people's awareness that Islamophobia is a problem, and it galvanizes action. So corporations might issue statements. Hollywood creates representations of Muslims finally outside of the context of terrorism. Universities include Muslims in their diversity initiatives. And there's a lot of activity. Experts like myself are called upon to give lots of talks and workshops and et cetera. There's a lot of attention. And then the crisis moment passes and attention wanes until the next crisis. And in these moments, you can get a lot of good work done, but I am suspicious and questioning about the extent to which change is possible if we're only focusing on the crisis, because the crisis exposes a long-standing issue. And so I look at a bunch of examples where Muslims are being included, and then there's some kind of compromise, or it's not fully addressed. So in the examples I was talking about in Hollywood, stereotype confined expansions is one example of there's change, but it's limited. I look at some hate crime cases against Muslims that made headline news. It was very new in the 2010s for it to become headline news. And the perpetrators of these hate crimes went to prison. They have multiple life sentences. So you could say justice has been served for these Muslim families who lost their loved ones. But in examining the issue, does that solve Islamophobia? And what I argue in that particular chapter is that we're not going to solve it unless we, if we're talking about violence against Muslims, also include state violence in that conversation. So we tend to individualize it. We've taken care of it. This individual committed a crime. The individual is going to jail. I have another chapter where I look at corporations who fire public figures for hate speech. And the individual, again, we can punish the individual, but what about the larger system? So oftentimes the crises lead to important changes, but not necessarily addressing the root causes leading to longer lasting change.
I find it interesting that you've served as a consultant for Hollywood studios and independent filmmakers, and you talk with them about how to better represent Muslim characters. So how can Hollywood do a better job with their representation of Muslim and Arab characters and storylines?
This is an exciting moment because we are seeing unprecedented expansions of representations more than ever before. But as I mentioned, sometimes the efforts fall short. So I teamed up with a colleague, Sue Obeidi, who is the director of the Hollywood Bureau at the Muslim Public Affairs Council. She does a lot of Hollywood consulting. And we created an Obeidi Alsultany test to help Hollywood improve representations of Muslims. And the test is specifically saying, we see you trying and we want to help you do better, because there are other tests that are outlining the problem. So in England, there is a Riz test named after the actor Riz Ahmed that points out the Muslim is portrayed as a terrorist, women are portrayed as oppressed, they're backwards, and outlining all of the problems. Our test is, for example, the TV show Transplant that was unprecedented and great. The first scene, something happens, it looks like it could be a terrorist attack, it could be a car accident. As a viewer, you're not sure, and you're wondering if the Arab man committed the terrorist act. Is that even needed in the storyline? So there's just these moments where it's like reverting to the old devices, even when you're trying to do something new. So the Obeidi Alsultany test has 5 criteria. The first is to encourage Hollywood writers, producers, executives to explore new stories. We don't have to redo the terrorism story. We don't have to redo the Orientalism story with Aladdin and Sinbad. There are so many stories out there to explore, and we'd love to see those stories. Another criterion is to have a Muslim writer in the room from start to finish. Oftentimes, as a consultant, you're asked to come in at the end. It's too late to change anything. Ends up being more damage control. So ideally, the consultant wouldn't even be needed. You just have someone, you're representing Muslims, you have people on your team, hopefully more than one, who's just part of the process for the whole time. Another criterion is that the character should not be defined solely by religion. There have been some Muslim characters, it's like they're robots, they're political beings, they're religious beings. Muslims are people like any other people, and religion is part of who they are, and it doesn't have to be front and center the entire time. Fourth is for the character to have a strong presence, and we don't expect there to be a Muslim character in every single production, but we have noticed that it's part of a diversity approach to add not just Muslims, but any kind of diverse cast in the background. You stick a few people in the background or a supporting role, so just to highlight that real diversity requires sometimes putting diverse people in front of the camera. And the last criterion is to highlight the diversity of Muslims, that not all Muslims have to be Arab or have to be South Asian, that we'd like to see the Latino Muslims, Black Muslims, Chinese Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, and really get to a sense of the diversity of the community and the many stories that are out there.
And what are some TV shows or films that you believe represent Muslim or Arab characters in dynamic, nuanced, and multidimensional ways?
Right now, for me, there are 5, and I mentioned them before, but for your listeners who aren't familiar with them, Hulu's Rami is about a millennial who is about his family. I call it a cringe comedy. It's very hard to watch. It's because he's constantly getting into really uncomfortable situations, but he's trying to reconcile his religion with living in a secular world. And there's nothing like it out there. And so it's one of the five that I think paved the way to the future. The other one is Mo on Netflix, which is about a Palestinian man and his family in Texas. And they're undocumented. And it's also just a very unusual story, unusual portrayal, story that you don't usually get about Palestinians in the US. We Are Lady Parts is my all-time favorite. I actually cried for most of the time I was watching it because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was so happy. It's a comedy about 5 Muslim women in England who join a punk rock band. And it's a portrayal of Muslim women that most people have not seen before. Sort of on HBO Max. It's about a transgender Pakistani Muslim. It's about their daily life as a nanny for a family with their best friend. And it's just, again, something that you don't ordinarily see. And it's just really important in terms of what's possible in the diversifying representations of Muslims. And the other is Ms. Marvel, Disney Plus. And we have a Pakistani Muslim teenager who is a superhero and she has superpowers. And I watch it and I think, wow, I imagine if I had this when I was a teenager, that would have been amazing. So those 5 are really the gold standard for me right now.
If you could create a show that you would like to see, what do you think that you would create? Like what kind of character, what kind of situations? If you could be the creator of a new show that would feature Muslim or Arab character or situations.
So I would go for my own personal story of, growing up in New York as Iraqi, Cuban, Colombian, Muslim in this family. I would do something around that, a coming of age story. But I should mention with this question that there is a lot of pressure today on people who are making these shows because we don't have a lot of them. And so sometimes, let's say Rami comes out and people say, that doesn't represent me. I'm Muslim and that doesn't represent me, and they get upset about it. And it's just not possible for one show to undo a century of harmful stereotypes. We need many, many shows. But right now, that is the way forward for each person to tell their story, each person to contribute a story so that hopefully one day we will have a true diversity of Muslim stories.
In your TEDx talk, you describe yourself as a pop culture junkie. Is there anything that you're watching right now that you'd highly recommend, in addition to the shows that we just talked about?
So I don't know if I would recommend these because they're pretty standard, but these are the kinds of things I'm watching right now that actually mean something to me. So we are in a moment where we're seeing a lot of diversifying of representations of many different groups, and I am really enjoying it. One of the shows I'm watching is Queen Latifah in The Equalizer. And The Equalizer was a show in the 1980s which had a white male lead. And so now to see Queen Latifah in that role. So it's a very standard formulaic show. So it's not like I recommend it like it's this amazing show. But for me, I just get so much pleasure in watching Queen Latifah kick some butt in this role. And similarly, I'm not a big fan of the NCIS series, but Vanessa Lachey on NCIS Hawaii, I just love seeing her in that role. I'm also watching The Cleaning Lady, and it's a crime drama series. And I'm watching it because I've never in my life seen a Cambodian woman and a Filipina woman in the lead role. So these shows are really, I think, really important. And we're in a moment right now where Hollywood is doing that. Over the summer, I watched the remake of Father of the Bride with Andy Garcia and Gloria Estefan, and I really enjoyed it. And, there are other groups that have been erased and marginalized, people who are differently able or neurodiverse. So I liked Deaf U. I like Love on the Spectrum. And similarly with LGBTQ representation, Pose is one of these stories that I've never seen told on television. So I think it's such an important TV show. And then, there are rom-coms like Uncoupled with Neil Patrick Harris. It's just nice to see a rom-com with a gay lead that focuses on that. I love Victor. I love Never Have I Ever. So all these stories that have, different groups of people who have long been marginalized, and seeing them, whether it's in standard fare or in telling their specific story, brings me a lot of joy.
And we now have a lot to add to our watch list. So this is fantastic. Love all those recommendations. And where can listeners find out more about you?
They can learn more about me on my website at evelynalsultany.com.
And I will add a link to your website in the show notes, and also a link to your most recent book so people can purchase it on Amazon.
Thanks, Dr. B.
It was wonderful to have you on the show, Evelyn. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thank you.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. Abed Nadir is an endearing character on the popular sitcom Community. What is his father's heritage? Abed Nadir's father is Palestinian. We'll end the show with something punny. What is Ice Cream's favorite TV show? Game of Cones. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.